Hi, I'm Gianluca Fiorelli and welcome back to the search session. Today we are going to have maybe one of the longest evangelists about structured data and semantics, search and semantic web in general. He's from Rotterdam. He's a consultant and really started his career, I can say it, somehow like me, not really like me, but surely he started his career in this field in the last century because it was 1998. So it sounds very, very old. But this guy is not that old at all. Especially his brain is not that old. It's, in fact, someone who anticipated many things that we are constantly talking for about 18 months. And he's also one of those that, let's say, I like him because he's very balanced. For instance, and we are going to talk about this topic, when it comes to structured data, he says, okay, structured data are great, but please don't overdo it. This person is Jarno van Driel. Hey, Jarno, how are you doing?
Hi, Gianluca. Thanks for having me. I'm doing fine.
It's my pleasure. Things are you in Rotterdam, right?
Yeah, the Netherlands.
Okay. So how's the summers going?
Oh, finally got a week of less heat. Last week we're like 34 till 36. And temperature dropped to 22.
Yay! Oh, that's cool. Well, and I hope it's not rainy because the times I go there in the Netherlands, it's quite a weird type of weather.
hmm
Sun, and all of a sudden, it's a kind of British weather. So sun, rain, wind.
On average, a bit more sun than in the UK, but comparable.
Okay. And how SEO is treating you lately?
Seems like I'm most of all spending time having tons of conversations about the sense and most of all nonsense about structured data. I think there's a lot of people, especially because of ChatGPT advice, have all kinds of weird ideas about what structured data is doing. So I'm having a lot of weird calls these days where in the past I used to have to convince people to start using structured data markup. And nowadays I'm spending more of my time talking the idea out of people's heads.
Yes, that's what I was saying before. I remember you did a wonderful and also funny experiment was that where you were substantially tagging with structured data almost every entity present on a page, if I'm not wrong, in a way to demonstrate that going that way, so overloading your code with structured data information is not even the correct way to use structured data. So
No.
if you would say in one phrase or short paragraph, okay, first of all, what is the difference between structured data and schema.org? Because I feel
Oh,
that people still have not understood that there is a big difference between the two.
yeah. Well, first of all, the term structured data is already a very convoluted term because structured data covers a lot of things. It covers Excel files, it covers tables, it covers structured data markup, what we're going to be talking about. So, structured data in itself can be many different things. When we're talking about structured data markup, we're talking about annotations made in a certain syntax. Now, that syntax can be RDFA, microdata, or JSON-LD, whereas the syntax itself carries no meaning. So to convey the meaning of the data you're sharing, you need to use vocabularies or ontologies. And Schema.org is one of those vocabularies out there that helps you to say, this piece of data is about a person. He or she has this name, lives in that city, is the author of this article. So those are all kinds of things you can express by using the Schema.org vocabulary because it contains all those terms that are machine readable, so to say. And so that's the biggest difference when people talk about schema markup. That's yet another convoluted term because schema markup can also be a plain JSON file according to the JSON schema that exists. So the technically correct terminology would be semantic metadata, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So years ago, the search engines decided to come up with a marketing term called structured data and to make it explainable to the everyday person out there.
I can understand it because, I mean, they need to talk because we usually think about it, about Google, for instance, or even Bing as talking to to developers or even people who knows webmaster, what they were calling webmaster. But actually, the most effort is the most important blog, for instance, of Google is the keyword blog, which is substantially talking to business owner, marketing people, not digital marketing people. So they need to explain things to dumb down, oversimplify things in order to make them understood. And I love that blog because usually it's where you can find what Google really is heading to. Sometimes you find the most interesting tidbits and strategic idea that Google want to push in that blog because it's talking directly to business owner, not to us. So to us, is talking about, okay, how you have to use the href flag and blah, blah, blah. But using structured data versus unstructured data is the easiest way to make it also visualize things. And it's fun that now another terminology is coming out. So it's something like structured data still versus prose. So prose used as, okay, talking about things without a real structure, like in prose, which is weird for me because it's structured data. What is poetic? Because
Mm,
it's like,
that way.
you know, you know, it's time of Ulysses, of the Odysseus. Now,
No,
now
let's be
on the
honest.
movies,
A lot of
so it's the hexameter against the prose. Hexameter is structured and the prose is not.
one could easily say that a lot of marketing content out there is actually just prose. It's a lot of blah blah and a lot of words without actually going
Yeah,
into
yes.
depth. It's trying to sell you an emotion instead of facts.
But I don't know if that could be even defined as prose. It would be just blabbering and or baroquism, if you want to go talking literature terms. I think that I don't know if you agree with me. Don't you think that returning to Google, that it is also somehow fault of Google, this kind of misunderstanding of the difference between structured data, schema.org, and eventually other definition of same sample of, things that are inside the big bucket of structured data? Because if we go to the only existing information about from Google about structured data, it's what was the structured data gallery that where Google is explaining how to use
Mhm.
structured data in order to obtain rich results. And the fact that Google is talking of structured data just in terms of rich results, even if put something like structured data is important, schemas is important for understanding the meaning, blah, blah, blah. But it's just one line and then everything else is rich result. Don't you think that it is also this original sin from Google for making people, especially in SEO, to not understand a lot of.
Mm, to be honest, I actually applaud Google for what they have done throughout all those years because I think they have probably the biggest knowledge repository on how to use structured data as opposed to any publisher out there. There is nobody with so much technical guidelines and so much explanation in their documentation. And sure, that has been a path. We look at the documentations of 15 years ago, those weren't that good. And there's a continuous evolution of that documentation. But I'd love to see do anybody out there do better than Google does actually. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. Not even close. Yet again, Google tries to explain those parts that actually matter to Google. So should they go as far as to explain all the theory around the linked open data, which is structured data markup is based on? Well, not really. They try to convince people to use the things that are important for their search engines. If you're curious to learn more, their documentation points to every resource there is. You can go to the W3C specifications. I think the bigger issue, and that's the similar issue you highlighted in your recent document about open knowledge format, is that the issues actually lie with the people in our industry. People don't read the actual source. So the loudest screamers in our industry have been trying to sell us unstructured data over the last couple of years because that's an easy sell and that makes them sound advanced. But the honesty is none of them have even spent a single minute over at Schema.org's GitHub and read about all those terminologies, why they're in there, in that vocabulary, what the use case was when we added those things to the vocabulary. I say we because I'm one of the volunteers out of dozens in there. Everything in there ended up in there with a certain use case in mind. But a lot of those use cases never materialized. And then now suddenly there are a lot of people that say, use all those terms. Yeah, those terms were added over a decade ago and never were used. So why would they be important right now? They're not.
Yeah, yes. In fact, it's interesting how this is something that I like to do every year when the Web Almanac, the chapter about the implementation of structured data again, is evolving during years. And let's say I think that somehow there are certain types of a schema or vocabulary that are very used. But I think, and I think you agree with me, that sometimes they are so used, not because really web owners, masters, developers, or even SEO really thought about them, but because, for instance, WordPress is the biggest and most used CMS. All the SEO plugins, we are thinking from the classic Yoast SEO, but also Pragmatic, if I'm not wrong, and their own section of structured data. So implementing schema.org by default according to certain characteristics. So that's why certain types, usually the types that Google recommends to use, and implemented in the way Google recommends to implement it for rich results. And they use Google does for painting also. SERPs are implemented by default. And so we see, okay, web page, article, local business, organization, and so on and so on.
Breadcrumb list. The interesting thing,
Truly,
especially about the Web Almanac overview, is if you, what is it? Take the top 50 classes that are used, and then you already got like 85% of everything that's been published. You take the top 50 classes and you remove everything that has not been part of Google's documentation. If you take out everything that has been a rich snippet, is or has been, then you suddenly have nothing left.
yeah.
What the Web Almanac clearly demonstrates is that 90% of the markup out there only exists because Google actually had a feature for it.
Indeed. And I think that sometimes there are things that Google should eventually, using the same philosophy, I'm not asking Google to change. Google should clarify, maybe in very specific cases. I mean, what I would like from Google, but it's, you can understand also the implied business need of Google to explain very well things, all the schema related to products,
Mhm.
because the schema related to product also are working together with the feed of merchant. Therefore, and because this feed of merchant feed not only organic merchant, but also Google Shop. And it's so important for the business ecosystem of Google that Google is really explaining, well, okay, you can use this for a variant, you can use this, but for this thing, this other for aggregate offer. I would like sometimes the same attention to detail
Mhm.
from Google for other things, because if not, we see people going very creative with schema.
I think the issue there lies with the people doing that and not so much Google's documentation.
Yeah, but
Y-
for instance, Google is telling us, if you think, for instance, in the travel industry, when we talk about the so-called by Google carousel, the item list is for European user, still the beta for having the rich results with carousel of the items, which is valid for obviously the retail, but it's also valid for travel. So implemented correctly, you can have the carousel of the hotels, for instance, that you are selling rooms, I don't know, in Madrid, in Rotterdam, and in other places. But then Google, when it comes, for instance, to hotel, doesn't help. There is always this question coming up. I work a lot with travel. This question coming up by clients or SEO in house of my clients asking me, how can I indicate the offer or the aggregate
Mhm.
offer? Because hotel formally doesn't have the offer. Then I usually, in this case, I'm lucky because for hotel, there is a wonderful guide inside schema.org website. We have all the indication for hotel and also for car dealers, I think, and precise indication on how to use a combine. It's very old, still using not use indicating example with JSON LD, but it's totally doable and totally followable. But sometimes I think, for instance, for software as
Do
a
you know?
service,
This is an interesting one. Do you know why the documentation over at Schema.org is so extensive? Because the
no.
entire hotel section was actually intended to be an extension. So there was a working group that actually created that extension for Schema.org, and that's why it's so in depth and why it so has contained such good examples. Because those have all been created by that specific working group.
That's great.
That's
And
the whole idea behind Schema.org. It's not supposed to be just a Google thing. It's supposed to be an open
no,
vocabulary where
I know,
everybody can
but
join.
yeah, but for instance, I would like a Google at least to put for the specific case of hotel. This is the link where you can find more information. Not necessarily you have to, because people, it's weird. SEO many times don't search.
No, that's my whole point. By what you also made in your article is that all the information surrounding Schema.org is out there. 95% of all the conversations surrounding the vocabulary, its sponsors, it's all there on GitHub, on the W3C. But some SEOs just go through Schema.org, think they found the magic terminology, copy that without even having a look at into why is it part of that vocabulary. Well, if you don't understand the why behind it, how can you come to the conclusion it's valid just because the word exists? It's like taking a dictionary and giving every word in the dictionary exactly the same weighting. You have to use every word in the dictionary or else you're not talking correctly or you're not writing correctly. That's not how a dictionary works. And that's the same thing for Schema.org. That's not how a vocabulary or an ontology works. You don't need to use everything. It lays out the options, but
I mean, there is an interesting citing still Google. There is somehow an exception where Google is saying, okay, I don't tell you what are the required properties and the recommended property, because Google does this distinction. In the only case that it does this, use as many property as you can if they are present in the visible part of the content of the page. And that's organization. And it's interesting that Google is making this exception for organization of not selling practically nothing in terms of recommendation, just telling you as a recommendation, just use it once on your own page or in your about page, where is the best page for using it. Problem is that organization then it could be also useful to cite it with the ID. The problem that ID, for instance, Google doesn't explain what is the ID and eventually how can you use it to connect.
it shows the examples mostly around product variants. There it shows and return shipping policy and things like that. There it simply uses fragment identifiers in the ID to link things together. I think Google has good reason not to delve into the why and how that works, because that's not the role of Google's documentation. How ID is supposed to work, and that's sort of the difficult part about it. That's why you have the actual specification out there. Now, people are looking at Google, and not just your comments. I've heard this comment throughout time. It's not up to Google to tell you what's already in the W3 specifications. If you want to learn HTML, you look at the W3C specifications. If you want to learn JSON LD, you look at those specifications. There you can go and learn how the syntax works. I think I get your point, but to ask of Google to be the creator of a vocabulary and explain how syntax works and explain how they want to do things, I think that's too much of an ask of Google.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I understand.
If anything, where's Bing? Bing has been
Oh,
silent
yeah,
for
yeah.
a decade already.
Well, I don't know Yandex because also Yandex was one of.
Yandex is out of the picture. It's close, sort of within Russia. It used to be. It was registered in the Netherlands. The EU forced it to be sold back to Russia. It's in Russian hands now, and due to the war in Ukraine, Yandex is out of the picture.
What other search engine
Yeah,
collaborating with Schema apart being?
originally it was Yahoo, Bing, and Google. Later on, Yandex joined as well. Pretty fast. Baidu never joined from China, but they sort of consume it in the background. So they're a silent consumer of structured data. Don't know if that's still valid these days. 10 years ago, that was the case. And what you're also seeing in I think it's South Korea, there's a
Never.
local search. Yeah, and they have a bunch of documentation themselves from what they consume. But if you look at that documentation, it's actually nearly a copy of Google's documentation. So now that Google, for example, officially has dropped FAQ page, I'm curious to see what those other search engines will do. But in all honesty, the main driver for more than a decade already has been Google for this. It's the one search engine that actually tells us what they want of us, who has been actively developing new features. And no other search engine out there has done that. No LLM out there has done that. They're the only one actually producing documentation surrounding structured data.
And talking about, you cited somehow a sort of recurring topic, FAQ. And it's fun because it became all of a sudden so popular again because of LLMs.
Yep.
And even if it was deprecated by Google, I think in 2023, for everybody, but very few sites. And now
government sites and medical
yes,
sites.
and now for the governments and the really, really reputed health sites is now also there. I think this is a wonderful example of how the cutoff training data can produce disaster because maybe the FAQ, okay.
I'm not even convinced the FAQ page did much to help to train LLMs. Reason being, with natural language parsing,
Yeah.
for years already, it has been so easy to extract FAQs because
I mean,
they follow
yeah,
a
yeah,
very
yeah.
strict pattern.
I mean, it's
So
one of the simplest form of structured data in props.
Yeah.
Because it's a question, it's an answer.
Exactly. And that's quite, it's been easy to extract that type of information already since late 2016. NLP was good enough to extract that without any guidance. I remember working on FAQ pages specifically for large e-commerce parties before FAQ page markup was even live originally. Google already gave perfect answers based on FAQ pages. So why the heck they ever invented the FAQ page snippet, it's beyond me. NLP had no need. And Google was already pretty good at answering questions before they launched FAQ. So why it ever existed is beyond me. If anything, if I think it caused a very negative pattern where everybody became lazy, stopped writing good product descriptions, and just slap an FAQ on the page. And I call that lazy.
Well, it depends. I mean, I can understand the need of using somehow FAQ, for instance, for some kind of product pages, product
Oh,
description
there are use
pages.
cases for FAQs,
Yes,
definitely.
but
But
okay, yes, but I understand that there is. Sometimes I see also, even articles that are substantially structured as they were FAQ pages, actually, on just because there is this sort of new myth, let's call it so, even if it's not really new myth, of LLMs prefers one chunk to question and answer. But talking about myth and relation with LLMs and how people are trying to advise for visibility in LLMs, what are the myths related to structured data, schema, and also other types you are seeing are becoming dangerously popular?
actually, it's quite stagnant for a couple of years already. Google, with the whole shift going from traditional search results to LLM-based search results, the problem has become that a lot of the original rich results do not fit into that AIO design answer pattern. Sure, we still have some traditional results if you're patient enough and keep scrolling. So the use case for a lot of the rich results that originally were designed is slowly disappearing. So what we've seen over the last couple of years is that Google has been cleaning up its inventory of rich results because they lost their purpose. That's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean markup has become less important. It just means that that one specific use case has reached end of life. And at this moment, the biggest use case there is, probably has to do because everybody wants the agentic web to start working, is product schema. And Google has been at it for 8 years now, approximately, step by step, aligning the merchant center specifications to what you can do with
2018,
structured data.
2018, yes.
Yeah,
So
roughly.
8 years because they started to show the rich results of popular products in 2018.
Yeah, there's a difference to what Google is doing in search and the discussions we've been having over at Schema.org. They're highly out of sync. I think I started the discussion around product variants around 2017, and it took only like 6 or 7 years to roll out into production. So it can happen that we've been discussing things over at Schema.org for quite some years already before you finally see it show up in Google search. And especially around the product markup, that's not that easy because Google Shopping is a separate environment technically than Google Search is. So the moment they want to apply things from Google Shopping into Google Organic, they need to create new algorithms, new scripts, new testing tools, new testing features, new reports, new Search Console, new result test features, and so on and so on. So it's actually quite involved for them to align those specifications between organic search and Google Merchant Center feeds, especially because the format of a Merchant Center feed is very simple. It's a flat table, column,
Yes.
rows. And yeah, structured data isn't that flat. It's a graph. So it goes left, right, up, down.
Yes, it's more three-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly. So translating one into the other is not always as easy as you think. And as they are creating new terms and new data shapes, we're also trying to evaluate, okay, this is what we got now, but we're going to create something new into the future. Are there any new things we need to take into account, which aren't part of Merchant Center either, but that need to be added to Schema.org right now because we're doing that, and later they show up in Merchant Center specification.
Yes, and it's maybe more important, even more important now that Google started to anticipate in merchant some, properties related to a product that are not in the schema. And this is making the consolidation of the data more problematic. So
Yeah,
it's,
it used to be years ago. It used to be more problematic than it is now because I remember a time where we had different structured data models on a page for Merchant Center, while at the same time providing a second piece of markup that was specifically for Google Organic. And
Mhm.
since those two sites didn't communicate with each other, the markup for Organic was causing errors for Merchant Center, and the markup for Merchant Center was causing errors in Google Organic. Those are really fun times. So every step they take, I'm happy because that's one less obstacle in the way of actually doing it in markup.
But okay, returning to the LLMs, not just Google. What is the biggest myth that you are seeing about the role of schema for LLM visibility?
The stubborn, persistent idea that you need to have structured data markup, machine readable markup, so you can serve those LLM machines. Nope. Yes, it's true. LLMs are machines, but there are totally different types of machines. LLMs are machines that take natural language into account. That's it. And structured data markup is created for RDF based machines. So, in an ideal world, structured data markup ends up in a RDF based knowledge graph, which is a fancy word for a database. It's just a database that works with triples instead of property value pairs. So that's the main difference between that and a regular database. But structured data markup is a markup that can directly be injected in that type of database. So it's an easy format to transport and move around. It's instantly injectable, instantly readable. So it's a very nice, clean, and practical format. But LLMs don't need that format. They're not created to work with those formats. LLMs are created to deal with natural language, where structured data fits in. And that's one of the things I'm very curious about. Andrea van Pili from WordLift is involved in, it's going to see, I think in August or September, something like that. There's going to be a workshop meetup for the W3C, and the GS1 is in there, and some Google peeps are in there, where they're actually going to be talking about creating a standard so that agents can navigate knowledge graphs. In theory, if you give an agent currently, you have a folder full of skills, you can relatively easily tell an agent, here's the skills, go travel that knowledge graph. The problem is that there's no standard surrounding that. So you run the risk of every company creating its own skill sets, every company offering different solutions to get agents to navigate knowledge graphs. So what they're doing now is Andrea Volpini ran some experiments over the last couple of months, which do definitely indicate that if you throw knowledge graph into the mix with agents and LLMs, then up to 80% less error rate. That sounds interesting. But For that, we need to have new standards. And what I like about this one is that there are people involved from companies like Samsung and Siemens that are also going to be up for that debate. So this is not just a search thing. This is an industry-wide and possibly a commerce international new method of exporting and transferring data. That's going to be very interesting.
But the lack of a standard, or the fact that the standard are working, are still in works in progress. Because I'm thinking about, well, you cited before my article about the open
Knowledge
knowledge,
format.
which is not even a standard. But
Yep.
there is, for instance, many SEO are talking as if was already established a standard for web p, and it's still not a standard at all.
It's just a
So
suggestion so far.
yeah, I can see people on LinkedIn or on X or in talks and so on, especially recommending already the implementation of WebMC for everything, which can be
Yeah.
of agentic use. When, for instance, in my personal point of view is, okay, testing, but I don't know, in a form that is not so important in a business level, you can test it there and see how it works. If it's really working, what are the results? How can you eventually use it eventually for other things in the future, and stay always looking at how this suggested standard is evolving to a confirmed standard,
Mhm.
set to the standard. But put all your eggs in that basket, I think it's still too early now.
To be honest, my opinion is very pragmatical about that. Unless you got a lot of money to burn, stay away from it. Any form of agent optimization. If you don't have the money to waste, don't get involved in it. Let the standards develop. It's going to take quite some time. We don't even know which of the LLMs is going to survive the coming years. So to say go after UCP and or AGP, ACP, or whichever standard or protocol you're thinking about doing, stop and ask yourself the question: will this platform still exist in a couple of years? Will ChatGPT actually survive? And again, unless you have a lot of money to burn, it don't really matter if you waste 100,000 here or left or right. It's probably best not to get involved in those technologies until everything sort of has been figured out over the next couple of years. There's a good chance a lot of those standards will disappear or will merge with other ideas. I think it's too early for a lot of businesses. If you're a small e-commerce shop, for example, you're doing quite fine. I don't like the platform Shopify, but that's a different discussion. But you're quite safe sitting on Shopify. It works together with Google. It works together with Bing. They make it happen for you without you having to do huge
Yeah,
investment.
because Shopify, for instance, the UCP is already
Yeah.
existing for every Shopify
And
every
that's the
Shopify
same thing
website.
for the average local business. Make sure you got your Google business profile really sorted out and that you actually make use of it properly and all the features it offers. If there's anything agentic that needs to happen, Google will first plug it into business profile to test it. So
Mhm.
instead of wasting a lot of
Yes, for
resources on the
recalls, for everything
yeah,
else.
so instead of wasting a lot of resources on rolling out MCP and agentic standards and you name it, hold on as a local business. Make use of your Google business profile. That's probably where your return of investment lies. Anything else is for those that can afford for themselves to play around with it. What I'm actually expecting, especially for you, if you look something like the open knowledge format, I've done a lot of use cases, worked on a lot of use cases in the past where structured data wasn't important for the public. It was important for the internal processes of that business. We had reasons to create a new database system, a new data warehouse, a new ERP system, and we based that all off on top of schema.org. The biggest motivator were internal reasons, making sure everybody in the business spoke the same business language, making sure that everybody followed the same sales rules and the same content guidelines, you name it. So we had all kinds of reasons to make that investment, but none of them were search. And I think that's for open knowledge format and for a lot of these standards that are coming out right now, I think the first use cases are mainly going to be internally and not so much the agentic web, because the agentic web sounds cool, but it doesn't generate all that much revenue quite yet. The
Yeah,
majority of
yes, indeed.
revenue still comes from traditional search.
And I think that pieces can be also. extended to when we talk about knowledge graph in the terms of internal knowledge graph. I mean,
Hmm.
a good implementation of schema with the ID or with graph, it's already somehow giving, creating a sort of archetypical knowledge graph of a website. But when I talk about knowledge graph, internal knowledge graph is, I usually do this example that I did also with in talks. Let's say you are in e-commerce, so you use as a knowledge graph, base of a knowledge graph, your catalog of product, and then create all the things related to each product. And my classic example are, Star Wars Legend mini painting. So, for instance, the miniature of Luke Skywalker is representative of Luke Skywalker's character of Star Wars, directed by. So, doing this is also a way. It's internal, creating an internal knowledge graph which can be used internally by an organization for different types of things, which can be from the simple business side. For instance, with a knowledge graph, I can understand if, I don't know, where I was in New York as this product or not, etc., and how to collect it, as many things, but also in terms of freeing your mind and starting seeing connection between things, also for the
I
content side.
think I think one of the coolest internal knowledge graph projects I've been part of, where I didn't do the technical side of things. I mainly guided tons of different departments in the right direction and had to create some data shapes. But it was more, I was the one running around in the business, making sure everybody was kept up to speed. If you work for an international organization with, let's say, 15,000 people staff, getting an up-to-date organogram out of a business is near impossible. But if you work in an international organization with 15,000 colleagues, finding the right one can be true hell. And there, an internal knowledge graph just for internal purposes that's up to date, that knows which departments exist where, which email addresses go with that department, which staff is working for that department, how you can reach out to those people. Having that information up to date, it sounds like a no brainer, but the majority of international large organizations, it's a crime to get your hands on the right person. It's near impossible. So, an internal knowledge graph can already be as simple as being able to generate an up to date organogram. I've used it also for a customer service department where they had a call registry system. We actually turned that call registry system into a knowledge graph so that it could not only serve customer service, but that we actually could also serve the website. And we actually monitored the most asked questions, and that determined the order of our FAQ pages, because that were actually the questions coming in on the telephone. And that was updated in real time. So no manual labor to get those questions up to the site. No question, any answer was in the call registry system. So we made it available to the website, but for that it needs to be in a knowledge graph format. So there are a lot of reasons why a knowledge graph can be very useful internally and actually can help companies make money without ever using it for search.
Yeah, yes. In fact, I think that was this case of a FAQ, for instance, was the kind of a example I was using too when I was talking about combining, creating an internal knowledge graph as a source of inspiration, because doing so, you can see the connection between things that are apparently not so evident. For instance, in the mini painting, you can really understand, for instance, with a knowledge graph, you can see the concept of the mini with the concept of a paint recipe. A paint recipe is what color to use to paint the mini in what sequence. Like when you are cooking something, that's why prolate recipe. And this is interesting because using the knowledge graph is very easy to understand what are the possible recipe. And so, because you know what are the recipe, you can understand what kind of related colors you can put in the PDP of a miniature. In order, if you want to paint this miniature, we suggest you this recipe. For instance, if you want to do rebel commandos in Endor, so some kind of tropical camo painting, or I don't know, Scarif, like Rogue One, tropical beach, so sandy kind of camo. And this is very practical use of. The problem is that creating knowledge graph, it is, even if it's theoretically simple because they are triples, and
Yeah,
it's,
unfortunately,
and
yeah,
it's so expensive because, well,
it depends on the skill set of the developers involved. And I
mhm,
think that's one of the issues. The majority of businesses do not have somebody who has experience with graph-based information. The average database engineer does not work with graph-based information. They work with property value pairs and tables still in these days. So A, it's a lack of knowledge and actual developers knowing how to work with that. B, majority of businesses do not have anybody internally championing a knowledge graph because that requires you to have somebody in-house with enough understanding and the vision on how that could apply to a business and then fighting for it internally and going through it to actually make it happen. And to be honest, there are just not enough of us out there to make that happen. So that's one of the reasons why adoption rates of knowledge graph has been lacking so far, is because there are not enough people out there who actually know how to do that. And here's the fun part: that's where LLMs actually help close that gap.
how?
If funny thing is that I see in my LinkedIn feed, I also follow a whole bunch of knowledge graph engineers, and one
Mhm,
of the earliest changes I saw is that in the past, people were very busy writing Sparkle queries. Sparkle is the triple for the RDF variant of MySQL queries. Sparkle is based on MySQL, so to say. And everybody was writing those queries manually. And now they're all using LLMs, writing human languages, and the LLM writes the query for them.
yes.
And more knowledge engineers are actually using LLMs solely and having the whole query technical backend being handled by agents and LLMs completely automated. Yes, it costs you a bit of tokens, but at the same time, if you cannot find the staff to do it for you, that's actually an easy way to open up a technology without having a huge new department to make it happen. It can be run with actually a few people, and some people actually have some vague idea of what they want to do. Already get you really far with LLMs nowadays.
And I want to recover now one thing. So returning a little bit back in time, I mean, you have a personal website. I'm joking in the email I told you, quite abandoned it, quite abandoned it. There is, because I was looking for things you wrote also in order to prepare this episode. And in your website, personal website, there is only one article, but it's very cool. It's
Yeah,
also a
it
little bit
contains
long.
about as much as the average website does as a whole.
So, in this article where you talk about schema fairy dust, which is a wonderful definition in
Mhm.
relation to EEAT. And before of a regular, we were talking about Rail Auto, like in the days, which was considered maybe one of the few Rail Auto, the end of the days. Actually talking about the type. Schema
Yeah.
author can be, and now when it comes to, for instance, articles, blog posting, and so on, Rail Author is also suggested by LLMs. It's one of the things, but also LLMs. One is FAQ. The other one is Auto, which is also deprecated by Google, for instance.
Quite
And
some years already.
yeah, and then there is the author. Author can be author, person, profile, whatsoever, this kind of thing. But let's say author. And what are the structural elements on a page that actually can move the needle for a machine trying to calculate the trustworthiness of an entity, for instance, which can be a person who is an author or a brand who is a publisher, for instance.
Mm, okay, we're getting a
Apart,
bit.
I mean, I say these structured kind of structured elements, and besides, obviously, many other things which can be backlinks, mention, positive mention, and all these kind of things.
To start off, and here we're getting a little bit into speculation from my end, but I personally don't believe trust can be based on any single page.
Right,
So
I do.
that's one of the main points I have in that ridiculous long story of mine is that you should never trust what an author says based on a single publication. That
Yes.
search engine don't do that either. They Trust is based on aggregated information. The last person they trust is the author itself. That's the last entity in the chain they trust. If you want to build trust, it's based on the aggregated information about an entity out there. And then in the end of the chain, they look at what the homepage or the entity home of such a page says about that person. And if that information coincides with the information aggregated on the web, then it forms a confirmation layer. That's great because that gives your data, the information your domain contains, a little bit extra trust. Trust not as in I trust you with my wallet, trust based as in data accuracy score. We can place a higher mathematical trust in the accuracy of the information you provide because generally you provide information that coincides with the information the search engine finds on the web. So in that regard, you cannot base trust on anything a person says. You put your money where your mouth is. If the internet says it's the case, then you're probably getting a good end on your way. Problem is, people are smart. They know how to fake online profiles. SEOs have mastered it throughout time. There are plenty of examples throughout the years where people created entire fake profiles just to elevate trust. And only in very few cases did that actually make money. Generally speaking, the majority of these things cost a lot of money with a very low return of investment. I don't say you cannot manipulate things. Obviously, everything can be manipulated, but the question always is the investment worth the effort? If you're looking at on-page elements, nowadays, I still think it's very important, same as it was back in 1998 and the early 2000s when I worked on accessibility. Make sure you got proper semantic HTML. Why? If you got proper semantic HTML, there are gazillions of algorithms and scripts out there that can translate HTML into Markdown. That type of information is being used by those same data consumers of your HTML.
And I think it's not a coincidence that Google went for the agentic part, which is important sometimes to be precise and say, this is documentation that is presented by Google developers on the agentic side of Google or even Chrome. And this is documentation prepared and presented by the search team. So to separate things. The developers, in the sense of the agentic side of Google and Chrome, it's not a coincidence that they talk about the accessibility now, which is something, I mean, I'm sure if I'm betting on how many SEO you are used to include accessibility audit in their big 50-page long audit, surely there will be 1-digit% of doing also that. And now it's coming out, people will say, you have to do it as it was something new. And we know it's a very painful. There are a few crawlers that are really helping you making this kind of audit. So for instance, a very stupid example is when web designers decide that what should be an heading is not an heading, but a text in bold with bigger fonts. And this is a classic example, which is going to semantic, is disrupting eventually the semantic sequence of a page. Because it could be an H2, could be an H3, what it is. It's
We're
just
going
a
to go
bold.
full circle to how I got into this stuff. When we talk about accessibility, the focus for SEOs 9 out of 10 times is, if they even look at it, it's the technical side of accessibility. Are we using a link instead of a button? Are we providing alt text? And descriptive alt text, actually, not just some automated thing that doesn't make sense for the image. But that's all technicality. There's a whole separate world to accessibility, which is much more interesting, and that's writing for accessibility. That's making sure that content is available for people who don't necessarily have an IQ of 120, who don't necessarily speak that language as their primary language. There are a lot of immigrants in this world. So how do you keep a text easily accessible to read while still conveying the information it needs to convey? And that's something I almost never see anybody talk about in the SEO world. Yeah, I've seen some presentations about it throughout the years, one here, one there,
I think, for
once a
instance, in
year.
this for the last example that you did, it's maybe something that international SEO are used to talk about because of localization. And
Mhm.
so It's something that we are used to do. One last question. Because you are someone who also, a part of your daily work is this one. You can read here international structured data concept. So let's do some speak, but also because you're really involved in the Schema.org Foundation and so on. And what do you see? What kind of evolution are you going to see? I don't want to do 10 years, but in the next couple of years, in everything structure that is going, are going to be even more important or less important, are going to be a bigger adoption of it, something like this. What kind of evolution are you going to see in this, let's call it the structured data semantic web landscape?
I think one of the things I'm been leaning towards over the last year is looking at Schema.org as a whole. Schema.org was designed for a different era. Schema.org was designed as a vocabulary for search in an era where LLMs didn't exist. Even back then, if you look at about 2/3 of Schema.org, maybe even 75% of it, was imagined on Schema.org version 0.9. There was a very small group of people, one or two of each search engine, that created their part of the vocabulary because they had to have, each of them had to have some input, and they imagined what the future would need. We're now 15 years later, and it has proven that predicting the future is very difficult, even for those people who actually work at those search engines. And in practice, 2/3 of the vocabulary ended up never being used. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a reset the coming years. I don't necessarily see Schema.org disappear, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a new vocabulary pop up. One that better aligns maybe with the agentic web. I'm saying that without seeing any obstructions right now. I don't see any conversations about people saying Schema.org doesn't fit into the agentic web. I just think that the majority of it doesn't serve a real life purpose anymore.
Okay.
So I think we need more focus. In the end, describing everything with ontology most of the time serves internal purposes, but for search engines and LLMs want to rely on natural language. So the focus is going to be even more on specific use cases for structured data. And right now, Google is busy enough with translating Merchant Center into markup. I'm most of all curious to see what will happen when that exercise is done. Once we've got Schema.org up to date to what's possible with Merchant Center, I'm very curious to see whether new things will come, because by that time, the whole agentic shopping should be crystallized as well. And then the question becomes, which other types of services, products will we see end up being part of the agentic web? We can fill it out easily. It's going to be travel. Food is probably in clothing, although those more or less fall under e-commerce, but food probably has a place still in there as well.
Yes, Google is always experimenting a lot with recipe.
Yeah, but not only recipe, literally food providing services, menus, things like that.
Okay.
Those are still very agentic capabilities. Seems to lure around the corner for those.
Yeah,
So I think the
the
biggest question is
deliverable.
where will we see the agentic web move towards? And I think
And
markup will follow that because it will serve that use case most of all.
I can see also another kind of use, which is maybe, I don't know, the classic problem of helping disambiguating entities. Because even if natural language algorithms sometimes still fails about understanding that you are talking about entity A, even if it's written exactly identical as
Mhm.
entity B. And this is maybe because of the many things surrounding a written content that can happen on a website, which can be maybe the context is hidden in a JavaScript that is not rendered. So it's not seen. And so there is no context, and so on and so on and so on. So many sometimes fringe cases. So something like maybe a classic property, one of the first, for me, one of the most important properties of schema, like the same as, is going to.
Funny thing is, so maybe sound like I'm patting my own shoulder. I'm one of the people who actually sort of pioneered entity optimization. And I'm going back to 2013, 2014. I was running a case study trying to resolve issues with Panda when even Google engineers no longer had an idea why a certain website was being hit. They couldn't make sense of why it was going up or down. And then I got a request to try to resolve that issue with structured data. And my working theory back then, and we're talking about 2014, was Google is getting confused in the details. It's not clear enough to them that this topic is a variant of that topic. And we're not talking about exactly the same thing on those pages. So I use structured data and entity optimization really to dive into what is this page about versus what is that page about. But we're talking 2014. That was an era when Google engineers were also experimenting with markup. Why? It was
Mhm.
new. They were trying to see what they could do with the markup people were putting out there. So I think for a part, that actually helped that website and that entire case study I presented around it back in 2015, because I was lucky Google engineers were playing around with this stuff. As of 2016, 2017, I already started noticing that the ROI no longer was there in that effort. Entity optimization, where practically speaking, SEOs are turning keywords into entities. That's all they're doing, really. Google's NLP had become so good that it already crossed the 85% benchmark in accuracy. So you're talking about back in 2017, 18-ish, that Google was wrong in 15% of the cases. Why was it wrong? Not because it was missing markup, because the entity involved didn't have a good enough digital footprint to be recognized as an entity. And this is the same confusion I still see SEOs make out there, where they go like, entity optimization markup is needed to be very specific to explain what the topic is about. No, moron, it's not needed. What is it? Google uses same as and identifiers to make sure that they understand they're talking about the right organization, the right place, the right person. They couldn't care less whether it's about checkers or chess. If your terminology is not clear enough to explain whether it's Puma shoes or Puma the animal, then you got some work to do on your pros.
Yes, yeah, yes, totally. I totally
So
agree.
in that regard, yes, I'm marginally somewhere there in the background. It does help Google recognize the entity you're talking about. I hate to use the word understand. So yes, it helps them recognize. But if you need that little bit extra to help Google understand and recognize what that page is about, you got probably better things to work on than additional markup.
Yeah, yeah, yes. And I think that entity recognition and entity understanding is also not just in the content itself on a page, it's also in how this content is linked and be linked by other piece of content
Exactly.
inside the
The
website,
bigger
outside
growth
the
picture.
website. Yeah. Yeah, no. 1 hour and 6 minutes. It's well,
Oh well,
let's
that went fast.
let's stop it here. But before, when you are not thinking about structured data and designing graph in your head, what do you like to do?
I'm a big fan of following certain Twitch and YouTube streams. And unfortunately, because of my three fingers, there's the camera.
Hmm.
I cannot use a game controller properly. So there are, and in my mind, I'm a big gamer still, but unfortunately, physically, I cannot play a lot of games. So instead of gaming myself, I spend time following certain streamers that actually play games that I like, as alternative for being able to play them myself.
Yeah, I understand. Well, maybe the future, let's see, one of the evolution of a technology would be, you know, a classic, just look using the eyes and something
Yeah,
else.
but there's a certain billionaire out there called Elon Musk that's working on a neurological interface, but
Well,
I'm
I
not
would,
sure how much I trust Elon Musk with
yes,
my brain.
I'm not really a fan of a neuromancer perspective. Sincerely, I wouldn't like to have a chip of a private company in my head.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Jarno. It was a real pleasure to have you here. Let's see, maybe in the future to organize something else, as maybe a panel with other ontologists and
Oh, that'd
lovers
be
of
cool.
semantic search. Thank you again. And
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thanks to everybody having watched us till now. Remember to subscribe to the channel, the search session on YouTube, but also on Apple Podcast and Spotify, and to ring on the bell so you will be notified for a new episode when they come. Thank you and bye.